Everybody, we're going to pick up on number 4, which is about pipeline performance. So this is probably going to be something similar to what we've seen in homeworks, so a little bit familiar. And it says, consider a gigahertz version of, so that's a clock speed. I like something that I think is kind of useless or useful. Sorry, useful for this type of question where we have like a lot of numbers is maybe writing some things on the side. So it's a 1 gigahertz pipeline. We're looking into a new 1.4 gigahertz version. Okay. This higher frequency results in higher costs of the increased number of cycles of all operations the ALU to complete by 1. So our new pipeline has 6 stages. The processor is still fully pipelined and every other stage works exactly the same. Branches are resolved in the MEM stage and data is always forwarded to the EX1 stage. Okay, so I've split up EX into 2 stages. Interesting. Okay, so first we're looking at the original pipeline, and we have a couple of benchmarking statistics. And it says, assuming no controller data hazards, what's the execution time of the 2 processors? Okay, so this isn't too complex or anything. So the old CPI is essentially, remember, this is a pipeline processor. So if I have no control hazards, I'm going to have a CPI that's pretty dang close to 1, right? Essentially, my CPI is going to be equal to 1 plus the, like, remember we talked earlier about how it takes a certain number of cycles for my pipeline to clear out, right? If I have a 5-stage pipeline and I run 1 instruction through it, it has to take 5 cycles to execute, right? Because it needs to go all the way through the pipeline. So it's going to be 1 plus the number of, it'd be the number of stages minus 1, right? Divided by the number of instructions, because I'm only going to have that first, like that 1, those 4 cycles, in the case of a 5-cycle processor once, right? It's not going to be 4 cycles every time. So I'm going to divide that by the total number of instructions, right? So in the case of a 5-cycle processor, the original one, I'm going to have, my CPI is going to be 1 plus 5 minus 4 over how many instructions are being executed, which should be, it's usually, it's 100 instructions. So my CPI is going to be 1.04. For our new processor, right, I'm going to have 6 cycles. Sorry, this should be 5 minus 1. So 6 minus 1 divided by 100. So this is going to give me 1.05. And so the execution time is going to be the CPI times the clock period, right? So here we have a CPI of 1.04. We're going to multiply that by or I guess essentially we're going to divide that by, so we have 1.04. We're executing 100 instructions, right? And how fast are we? We're going to divide by how fast we're executing them, right? Which in our case is going to be 1.0 gigahertz, right? Gigahertz. And so if I do the math, we get 104 divided by 1.0 gigahertz. When we're dividing by a giga, the inverse is kind of nano. So it's a little bit easier just to say 104 nanoseconds. Cool. So then I can do the exact same thing for my new processor, right? It has a CPI of 1.05, 100 instructions divided by, instead here it'd be 1.4 gigahertz. Essentially 1.4 times 10 to the 9th, right? And so the answer I get would be 105 times 10 to the -9th seconds, which is, a nanosecond. or no, wait, it won't be 105. It'll be 105 divided by 1.4, which let me pull out my calculator. 105 divided by 1.4, 75. So we're going to have 75 times 10 to the negative 9 seconds, which is 105 nanoseconds. Or shoot, 75 nanoseconds. And so we have our answer there. So then ask, what's the CPI of the new processor taking data and control hazards into account? Okay, so now we have to kind of consider how our changes to the pipeline creates new or affects different hazards. So I think let's start with control hazards. So now control hazards. Control hazards, instead of just taking 3 cycles, because it used to resolve, 3 cycles ahead of the ID, because our EX or execution is done after 2 cycles of EX, I'm going to have 4 cycles of assuming I speculate wrong, right? So, so I guess control hazards when we speculate wrong are going to result in 4 stalls. That's one change. So then with regards to data hazards, right? All of a sudden, all of my data hazards, the stalls associated with them are going to grow by 1, right? Because I essentially added a cycle between when instructions complete executing, regardless of whether they're an add, a load, or, I guess stores don't really matter, but an add, a load, a nor, the R type instructions are going to increase by 1, as well as my loads. And so as a result, the stall associated, we're using detect and forward, right? So if we're using detect and forward, the stall associated with a load is now 2 stall. We're going to have 2, right? If I have a data hazard. And for other R type instructions, so that's adds and nors, we're going to have we're going to have 1, right? Because with detect and forward, we got it down to 0. So now we're going to go and get ourselves a number. I'm going to switch colors here because I feel like it's a lot of pink. Okay. So our CPI is going to start at 1, right? What if we had a CPI that started that had no data hazards? And then we have to maybe account for the 5 divided by 100, right? Which is what we counted for here, which is how we got that 0.5. And that's for stuff passing through our pipeline. I think on the exam, when they graded it, they didn't really need you to do that. If you add that 500ths, that's great. If you don't, whatever. But I generally include it. Okay. So then now we kind of have to account for control hazards. So how often are control hazards going to occur, right? So I know I'm going to stall 4 cycles when they do occur, but how often are they going to occur? So essentially, first question is, how often do branch instructions occur? So apparently they occur 10% of the time. So at maximum, 10% of the time, I'm going to be wrong. Or 10% of my instructions, I'm going to have control hazards. But, I'm going to be using prediction, and it looks like we're predicting not taking. So how often do I take branches? Those are going to be cases in which I have to, I'm going to have control hazards. Well, it says 30% of branches are taken. So 70% of the time I'm going to be right, 30% of the time I'm going to be wrong. And when I'm wrong, I have a control hazard. So 10% of the time, this 10% accounts for how often branches occur, and this 30% accounts for how often I am wrong. So then let's look at control hazard or data hazards. So how often do data hazards due to load instructions occur? Well, 15% of the time I have a load, And it looks like 30% of instructions are dependent on the one before them, and 10% are the ones are not dependent on the one before them, but are dependent on the one after them. So this tells me a couple things. Because I have two loads, right? There's two combinations of instances that I can have, right? I could have a load and then a non-dependent instruction and then a dependent instruction, like an add, right? Or I could have them sequentially, right? In the first scenario, I'm only going to have to stall for one cycle. In the second scenario, I'm going to have to stall for 2 cycles, right? So that's going to affect a couple of things. So if I stall for 2 cycles, so how often am I going to stall for 2 cycles? Well, I can multiply the entire number by 0.15. This is going to be the combined loads, right? So 15% of the time I have a load. Of that 15%, 0.3% of the time, or 30% of the time, I'm going to have I'm going to stall for 2 cycles because it's going to be dependent on the instruction immediately before them. And 10% of the time, so 0.1, I'm only going to have to stall for 1 cycle. Great. So that's data hazards for loads. And then lastly, we have, sorry, I know it's getting a little bit messy, but lastly, we're going to have data hazards associated with R-type instructions. So that's going to be adds and nors. Remember, we don't need any, stores don't update a register, and so they're not going to result in data hazards. So each of those are going to take the same time. So 55% of my instructions are, 55% of my instructions are adds or nors. And then how many of them are dependent? Well, 30, if it's only 1 cycle, only the 30% number is going to apply, because who cares if it's not immediately in front of it. And so we're just going to have to multiply this by 0.3. And so we could add that number up. I am too lazy to. I'm going to pull up the instructions really quick. Okay. 1 plus, yeah, it says okay to account for 5 cycles of startup to. Okay, with my solution, I think I would get 1.44, but if you didn't include this 500ths right here, you'd get 1.39, which is what the solution guide has. Okay, so that's number 2. So now we have a CPI of 1.44 for our new processor, assuming this benchmark. So this question asks us to explain the impact of adding the extra stage on control and data hazards. So we talked about control hazards, so we kind of already went through this, but the control hazards, we added a stall, an additional cycle of latency as a result of extending our pipeline. It takes longer for us to determine whether a branch is going to be taken or not. And as a result, I'm going to have an extra stall. 1 second. I'm going to have an extra stall. So then if I have then asks us to talk about data hazards. So control hazards, control, we talked about how longer to determine misprediction, right? And as a result of it taking an extra cycle to determine whether we mispredicted, we're gonna have an additional cycle there. So then with regards to data hazards, we are going to have an additional cycle of latency for all of our adds, nors, and our loads, right? So the way that so I guess talk about like additional cycle. But that's kind of like what we talked about. The previous question really asked us to calculate it. Honestly, out of personal preference, I think it would have been more useful to put number 3 before number 2 when I took this exam, but I didn't write this exam, so no comment on that. But the main idea is control hazards are longer because it takes us longer to determine whether we mispredicted, and data hazards can be 1 cycle longer because it takes extra long to compute the result. And so we can't forward as fast. Okay, so then it asks us, it says, consider a new program, the modified characteristics. Okay. So recalculate. What would be the expected CPI using detect and forward, detect and stall. Okay, old pipeline. Okay, so these questions are kind of like throw your new pipeline out the window. We're going to stick to the old one. What's the CPI? So here in this first one, remember, we have detect and forward as well with detect and stall for branches. So whenever we see a branch instruction, because we're using detect and stall, we're going to stall for 3 cycles, right? Whenever we see any other type of conflict, we're going to resolve them using detect and forward. And remember, in our old pipeline with detect and forward, I'm only going to stall when I have a load instruction followed immediately by a dependent instruction. I'm only going to stall for 1 cycle. So my CPI is going to be my 1 for the baseline. Here, I don't really make could account again for the 4 divided by 100. You don't have to. I'm not going to, just because it'll take a little bit longer. And so I can stay in line with the solution guide. So first, how often are we going to have control hazards? Well, every time I see a branch instruction, because I'm stalling. I'm doing detect and stall. So I'm going to stall for 3 cycles times every time I perform a branch instruction. So this is control hazards. So then when I have data hazards, the only data hazard I'm going to have is when I perform a load instruction. And so how often do I perform a load instruction? 15% of the time. How often is it followed immediately, right? It looks like 30% of the time. And I'm only going to stall for 1 cycle. So if I add up these numbers, I can actually do this in my head. 1.3 plus 0.45. So 1.345 is going to be the CPI. So then this next question, super similar question, except it tells us to use predict not taken. Same thing. So our load stalls are going to stay the same. So I'm just going to copy that over. So we can start with our CPI. We can start as 1. The data hazards are going to stay the same. All we changed is our control hazard resolution. So then what is our new control hazard timing? Well, it's still going to be 3 cycles whenever we're wrong. But instead of essentially performing control hazard every single time, we have to factor in, basically, when are we wrong? Or how often are we wrong? So it says that 30% of branches are taken, which means 30% of the time I'm going to be wrong because I'm predicting not taken. And so if I multiply that, then all of a sudden my CPI will go down to 0.45, 0.9. So 0.9 plus 0.45. So 1.135 is the number that I got. I can check this really quick. Yep. So these are going to be the CPIs. You can remember, you can still factor in the overhead for stuff going through, but generally when you're doing CPI calculations, I feel like you don't need to, and you shouldn't, because once you turn on your computer, that 4 cycles or whatever those boot up cycles will get amortized, and what's 1 divided by 10? 0.1, pretty significant. 1 divided, if I execute 1,000,000 instructions, which is which happens every second on some of your computers, that value is just so minuscule that it doesn't really affect runtime. So cool. So we'll pick up on number 5 next time.